There is a deadline buried inside a 25-page government document that almost nobody outside the defense industry has read, December 31st, 2031. After that date, if the Pentagon has not finished rewriting the invisible code that protects nuclear weapons, satellites, and battlefield communications, the United States military could be operating on borrowed time. And the officials who wrote that deadline used a word they almost never use: existential. Let that sink in for a moment. This is not a think tank warning, not a headline written to grab clicks, not a prediction from a tech blogger trying to sound dramatic. This is the United States Department of War, the institution that oversees the most powerful military machine ever assembled, putting its name on a document that says, in plain language, that a piece of technology which does not yet fully exist could unravel the entire foundation of American national security. And this was not the first time they said it. It was the second. To understand why the Pentagon is suddenly speaking this openly about a threat most people cannot even picture, you have to start with a question that sounds almost too simple. What actually protects a nuclear weapon from being launched by the wrong hands? What stops an enemy from listening in on a battlefield radio, or hijacking the guidance system of a fighter jet, or reading classified files sitting on a military server thousands of miles away? The answer, in almost every single case, is math. Specifically, a very particular kind of math called asymmetric cryptography, and it has quietly kept the digital world safe for nearly 50 years. Asymmetric cryptography relies on problems that are almost impossible for a normal computer to solve. One of them involves taking an enormous number, hundreds of digits long, and trying to figure out which two prime numbers were multiplied together to create it. A classical computer, even the fastest supercomputer on the planet, would need longer than the age of the universe to brute force its way through that problem for a sufficiently large number. Another version relies on something called elliptic curve mathematics, a slightly different but equally punishing puzzle. Together, these two mathematical walls form the backbone of almost every secure system on Earth, from your online banking password to the encrypted link between a Pentagon official and a nuclear submarine. For decades, that wall has been considered unbreakable in any practical sense, not because nobody has tried, but because the amount of computing power required to break it did not exist, and under the rules of classical computing, never would. That assumption is what modern military communications, financial systems, and government secrets have been built on top of. And that assumption is exactly what is now collapsing. The reason is a very specific and very real branch of physics called quantum computing. Unlike a normal computer, which processes information as a simple string of ones and zeros, a quantum computer uses particles that can exist in multiple states simultaneously. Without going too deep into the physics, the practical result is staggering. A sufficiently powerful quantum computer running something called Shor's algorithm could, in theory, solve the exact mathematical problems that protect modern encryption. Not in the age of the universe, but in a matter of hours or even minutes. The wall that has protected digital secrets for half a century would not just weaken. It would fall completely and almost instantly the moment a machine capable of running that algorithm at scale comes online. This is the machine the Pentagon's new strategy refers to by a chilling acronym CRQC, short for Cryptographically Relevant Quantum Computer. It does not exist yet. Nobody has built one. But that is precisely the problem, because the danger is not really about the future. It is about right now. Here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Even though no country on Earth currently has a quantum computer capable of breaking military-grade encryption, that does not mean adversaries are waiting patiently for one to be built before they act. Intelligence agencies around the world, including sophisticated state-sponsored hacking groups, are already engaged in something security experts call harvest now, decrypt later. The strategy is simple and deeply unsettling. Adversaries intercept and store massive amounts of encrypted data today, communications, classified files, military transmissions, even if they cannot read a single word of it right now. They are betting that within the next 5, 10, or 15 years, a quantum computer capable of cracking that encryption will exist. When that day comes, all of that harvested data, some of it decades old but still operationally relevant, will be unlocked all at once. Think about what that actually means for a military. A piece of classified communication about troop movements from today might feel outdated by the time it could theoretically be decrypted years from now. But other categories of information do not expire so easily. Nuclear command protocols, long-term strategic plans, the identities of intelligence assets, the design specifications of weapon systems that will still be in service a decade from now, none of that becomes safe just because time has passed. If anything, some of it becomes more dangerous the longer an adversary has to study it in complete secrecy before deciding how and when to use it. This is the exact scenario that pushed the Department of War to release its first ever enterprise-wide Post-Quantum Cryptography Strategy in the summer of 2026. It is a 25-page document, And unlike a lot of government policy writing that tends to hedge every sentence into meaninglessness, this one is unusually direct. It does not tiptoe around the danger. It states plainly that quantum computing represents an existential threat to military operations, and it explains exactly why. The strategy singles out two categories of risk as the most severe. The first is the authorization and deployment of nuclear weapons. If the communications infrastructure that verifies, authenticates, and transmits nuclear launch orders can be compromised, intercepted, or spoofed by an adversary using quantum decryption, the entire chain of command built around nuclear deterrence becomes suspect. The second is the coordination of military maneuvers with allied and partner forces. Modern warfare depends on secure, real-time communication between allied militaries, coordinating troop movements, sharing intelligence, synchronizing strikes. If an adversary can decrypt those communications, even with a delay, the strategic advantage the United States and its allies have relied on for generations begins to erode. The document does not stop at describing the danger in the abstract. It lays out specific ways an adversary equipped with a cryptographically relevant quantum computer could act. They could collect and decrypt classified information transmitted across terrestrial networks, satellite links, radio frequency channels, and virtually any other communication pathway the military relies on. They could potentially take control of and even weaponize systems that were never designed to withstand this kind of intrusion. And in some of the most alarming scenarios described, they could install malicious code into weapons platforms in ways that cause integrity failures during live operations, meaning a weapon or system could be compromised at the exact moment it matters most. Kirsten Davies, the Chief Information Officer for the Department of War, has become the public face of this warning, and her language has been remarkably blunt for someone in her position. She has said that nearly every deployed military asset will be affected in some way by this transition, that adversaries will continue probing for weaknesses throughout the process, and that significant costs will be incurred along the way. She has also stressed that without a full transition to post-quantum cryptography, systems ranging from nuclear weapons launch infrastructure to ordinary logistics networks could effectively be paralyzed. Not damaged, not slowed down, paralyzed. So what is the Pentagon actually doing about it? The strategy lays out a binding, non-negotiable timeline. Every high-impact national security system across the Department of War must be secured with quantum-resistant cryptography by the end of 2030. That is not a suggestion or a goal. It is treated as a hard deadline. Beyond that, every single deployed military system, without exception, unless specifically authorized otherwise, must be operating on post-quantum cryptography by December 31st, 2031. Given the sheer scale of military infrastructure worldwide, from nuclear submarines to fighter jets to satellite networks to battlefield radios, that timeline is aggressive by any government standard. This strategy did not appear in isolation. It was released one day after the president signed two separate executive orders establishing similar quantum security deadlines for civilian federal agencies, signaling that this is not just a Defense Department concern, but a whole of government response to an emerging technological threat. Together, these actions represent one of the most significant coordinated cybersecurity transitions in modern American history, on par with, and arguably larger in scope than, the shift to modern Internet encryption standards decades ago. You might be wondering why now. Why is this suddenly urgent in 2026, when quantum computing has been discussed as a distant, futuristic threat for years? The answer lies in two pieces of research that quietly reshaped how experts think about the timeline. The first comes from the Global Risk Institute, which has conducted an annual survey of quantum computing experts for 7 years running. In March of 2026, that survey found that expert estimates for the probability of a cryptographically relevant quantum computer emerging within the next 10 years had climbed to somewhere between 28 and 49%. That range might sound modest at first, almost like a coin flip weighted toward unlikely. But context matters enormously here, because this is the highest probability estimate recorded in the 7-year history of that survey. The trend line is not flat. It is climbing, year after year, as the people closest to this technology grow increasingly confident that the breakthrough is coming sooner rather than later. The second piece of research is even more striking, and it comes from inside the very industry building these machines. In May of 2025, a researcher at Google's Quantum AI division published a paper that fundamentally changed the math behind this entire conversation. Previous estimates suggested that breaking a widely used encryption standard called RSA 2048 would require roughly 20 million physical qubits, the basic building blocks of quantum computers. That number offered a kind of psychological safety net, because building a machine with 20 million qubits still felt impossibly far away, decades into the future by most estimates. The new research revised that number downward by roughly 95%, suggesting that under 1 million qubits might actually be sufficient to accomplish the same task. When a required resource drops by that magnitude almost overnight, the entire timeline for when this threat becomes real compresses dramatically. Suddenly, a machine that felt like science fiction started to feel like an engineering problem, and engineering problems, however difficult, tend to get solved faster than physics ones. This is precisely why the Pentagon's language shifted from cautious monitoring to declaring an existential threat. It is not that quantum computers suddenly appeared. It is that the runway to build one capable of breaking military encryption got dramatically shorter, almost overnight, based on legitimate peer-reviewed research rather than speculation. And this is not a purely theoretical concern confined to strategy documents and policy papers. It is already showing up in real acquisition decisions across the military. Take the F-35 fighter jet, arguably the most advanced and expensive weapons platform in the American arsenal. In May of 2026, the F-35 Joint Program Office published a sole source solicitation notice through Naval Air Systems Command. The purpose was to modify the aircraft's inline file encryption device, the hardware and software component responsible for encrypting and protecting the signed code running the jet's internal systems, so that it could support quantum-resistant algorithms. Lockheed Martin Aeronautics was identified as the only qualified source capable of performing this work, underscoring just how specialized and urgent this kind of modification has become. Think about the implications of that single acquisition notice. This is not an abstract policy discussion happening in a conference room in Washington. This is a physical modification being made to one of the most sophisticated fighter jets on the planet, specifically because officials are concerned that its current encryption could eventually be broken by an adversary with access to a sufficiently powerful quantum computer. If the F-35 needs this kind of hardening, it raises an obvious question about how many other weapons systems, communication networks, and pieces of critical infrastructure across the entire military are quietly undergoing similar upgrades right now, many of which will never make headlines. It is also worth understanding that this warning did not come out of nowhere in 2026. Concerns about quantum computing's threat to military cryptography have been building steadily for years, even if they only recently crystallized into an official, binding strategy. Back in 2022, the Department of Defense's outgoing chief data officer at the time gave an exit interview in which he warned that not enough senior leaders were grasping the cybersecurity implications of quantum computing, and that when the technology fully arrived, it would be, in his words, a shocking moment for both industry and government alike. At the time, that warning registered as a distant, almost academic concern. 4 years later, it reads less like a prediction and more like an accurate forecast of exactly what has now become official Pentagon policy. There's also a geopolitical dimension driving this urgency that cannot be ignored. The United States is not the only country racing to develop quantum computing capabilities, and it is certainly not the only country aware of the strategic advantage that being first would provide. Other major powers have poured billions of dollars into quantum research programs, treating the technology as both a scientific frontier and a potential military weapon. Whoever achieves a stable, scalable, cryptographically relevant quantum computer first will not just have a technological edge. They will have the ability to potentially read years, even decades, of an adversary's stored communications almost overnight, gaining insight into military strategy, intelligence operations, and diplomatic negotiations that were never meant to see daylight. That is not a small advantage in modern warfare. In some ways, it could be the single largest intelligence windfall in the history of espionage. This global race is part of why the National Institute of Standards and Technology has been working for years to finalize post-quantum cryptographic standards, algorithms specifically designed to resist attacks from quantum computers rather than relying on the mathematical assumptions that quantum machines are expected to break. Several of these standards were finalized back in August of 2024, giving government agencies and private companies a concrete foundation to begin building on. But finalizing a standard on paper is very different from implementing it across every single system, network, and piece of hardware currently in operation. That gap between having the tools and actually deploying them at scale is exactly what the Pentagon's new strategy is trying to close, and close quickly, before the window of opportunity narrows any further. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge the sheer scale of the challenge involved. This is not like updating an app on your phone or pushing a routine software patch across a corporate network. Military systems are often decades old, built on legacy architecture that was never designed with quantum-resistant encryption in mind. Some systems are embedded so deeply into physical hardware, like the encryption device inside the F-35, that upgrading them requires physically modifying the equipment itself, not just rewriting a few lines of code. Multiply that complexity across every branch of the military, every weapons platform, every satellite, every communication network, every allied partnership requiring interoperable secure systems, and you begin to understand why officials describe this transition as one of the most significant technological undertakings in the department's history. Engineers working on this transition have already acknowledged publicly that early prototyping efforts have revealed the need to constantly adjust requirements as the migration progresses. In other words, this is not a straightforward, predictable rollout where every step goes exactly according to plan. It is closer to performing complex surgery on a system that has to keep functioning the entire time the surgery is happening. Because military communications cannot simply be shut down while new encryption gets installed. National security operations continue around the clock, which means this upgrade has to happen in real time, on live systems, without ever creating a gap that an adversary could exploit during the transition itself. And that raises perhaps the most uncomfortable question buried inside this entire story. What happens if the timeline slips? What happens if 2031 arrives and not every system has successfully transitioned? Or worse, what happens if a cryptographically relevant quantum computer emerges sooner than even the most pessimistic expert predictions suggest, catching critical systems still vulnerable in the exact window officials were racing to close? The Pentagon strategy does not pretend these are minor risks. It explicitly acknowledges that costs will be incurred, that adversaries will continue probing for weaknesses throughout the process, and that this transition represents only what officials themselves have called a first step, not a finished solution. That phrase, a first step, deserves attention. It suggests that even the officials writing this ambitious, binding, multi-year strategy understand that solving the quantum threat is not simply a matter of flipping a switch to new encryption algorithms and declaring victory. Quantum computing itself continues to evolve. The algorithms designed to resist quantum attacks today could, in theory, face new vulnerabilities discovered years from now, requiring yet another wave of upgrades, another set of deadlines, another chapter in what is shaping up to be a permanent and ongoing arms race between offensive quantum capabilities and defensive quantum-resistant cryptography. This is ultimately why the word existential carries so much weight in this context, and why it is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as government hyperbole. An existential threat is not simply a serious problem or costly inconvenience. It describes a risk capable of fundamentally undermining the thing it threatens, in this case, the secure functioning of the most powerful military on Earth. If nuclear command communications, weapon systems integrity, and coordinated military operations all depend on encryption that could theoretically be broken by an adversary's quantum computer, then the stability of military deterrence itself, the very concept that has helped prevent large-scale global conflict for decades, becomes uncertain in ways that ripple far beyond any single battlefield or weapons platform. For most people outside the defense and cybersecurity world, this entire conversation might feel abstract, something happening in government buildings and classified briefings that has little bearing on everyday life. But the truth is that post-quantum cryptography is not just a military concern. The same encryption methods protecting nuclear launch codes also protect online banking, medical records, corporate communications, and virtually every piece of sensitive digital infrastructure that modern society depends on. When the Pentagon calls this an existential threat and commits to a binding multi-year transition, it sends a signal far beyond military circles. It tells every industry, every financial institution, every government agency around the world that the era of assuming current encryption will simply remain safe indefinitely is over. Consider the financial sector for a moment, because it offers a useful mirror to what the Pentagon is grappling with. Banks around the world rely on the exact same mathematical foundations, the same factoring problems and elliptic curve puzzles to protect trillions of dollars in daily transactions. Analysts within that industry have already begun describing quantum computing in strikingly similar terms, warning that for some institutions, the risk is not just systemic, it is existential, echoing the precise language now formally adopted by the Department of War. Financial regulators have been slower to act than the military, and some critics argue that smaller banks and financial institutions, the kind without dedicated cybersecurity teams or massive IT budgets, may simply be left behind when the transition accelerates. If the most well-funded, most technologically sophisticated military organization on the planet is describing this as an urgent, existential priority requiring a binding multi-year deadline, it raises uncomfortable questions about industries with far fewer resources to prepare. The same logic extends to critical infrastructure well beyond banking. Power grids, water treatment systems, transportation networks, and telecommunications. Infrastructure all rely on layers of digital security that assume today's encryption will hold. Cybersecurity agencies have been publishing guidance for years urging both public and private sector organizations to begin planning for what they call the post-quantum era. But planning documents alone do not protect a power grid. Implementation takes years, sometimes decades, particularly for infrastructure that was never designed with modern cybersecurity threats in mind, let alone a threat as fundamentally disruptive as quantum decryption. The Pentagon's aggressive 2030 and 2031 deadlines may end up serving as a model, or at minimum a wake-up call, for industries far outside the world of national defense. There's also a financial dimension to this story that rarely makes headlines, but matters enormously. Transitioning an organization as vast as the United States military to entirely new cryptographic standards is not cheap. It requires new hardware in some cases, extensive software rewrites in others, rigorous testing to ensure new systems remain interoperable with allied militaries, and a workforce trained to understand and maintain infrastructure that barely existed a few years ago. Officials have been candid that costs will be incurred throughout this process, and while exact figures have not been fully disclosed, the scale of a military-wide cryptographic overhaul touching nuclear command systems, fighter jets, satellites, and battlefield communications networks suggests a price tag that will likely run into the billions of dollars over the coming years. Yet when you weigh that cost against the alternative, doing nothing, and hoping the timeline for a cryptographically relevant quantum computer stays comfortably distant, the calculation becomes far less complicated. National security planning has always operated on a principle of preparing for worst-case scenarios long before they become inevitable, precisely because the cost of being caught unprepared is almost always higher than the cost of preparation itself. Nuclear deterrence, missile defense systems, cybersecurity infrastructure, all of it exists because waiting until a threat fully materializes before responding is simply not an acceptable strategy when the stakes involve national security on this scale. None of this means panic is the appropriate response. It means vigilance is exactly what a binding deadline, a public acknowledgement, and a coordinated multi-year strategy are designed to enforce, rather than allowing this threat to quietly drift toward crisis the way so many technological warnings have in the past. Whether a fully cryptographically relevant quantum computer arrives in 5 years or 15, the Pentagon has made its position unmistakably clear. This is not a distant hypothetical scenario reserved for science fiction. It is an active, funded, deadline-driven priority, sitting at the very top of national security planning, treated with the same gravity once reserved for nuclear proliferation and large-scale cyber warfare. And for anyone who has spent the last few years dismissing quantum computing as an overhyped buzzword confined to tech conferences and speculative headlines, this should serve as a wake-up call. The institution responsible for protecting the most sensitive secrets on the planet is no longer asking whether this threat is real. It has already answered that question in writing, with a deadline attached, and it is racing against a clock it did not choose but can no longer afford to ignore.